Welcome to the conference of the European Academy of Religion. I greet you all who are here on site in this room and in this conference, but also all those who are participating online from Münster in Germany. And I hope very much that everything in this hybrid format of this conference works well for you. We had some small technical problems in the beginning, but I think now they should be sorted out and that everything has full participation. I welcome you very much in Münster, be you physically or be you virtually here. Münster in Westphalia is well known because of the Westphalian Peace Treaty in the year 1648, which is seen as the founding document of the modern state, finishing 30 years of religious wars in Europe. If you who are physically here want to commemorate this event, then you can walk from the conference location about 200 meters to the town hall and visit there the historical Peace Hall where the treaty was signed. We are here in this building, in this conference venue in the Westphalian Wilhelms University of Münster, which is a classical German full university with all subjects except technical science. Around 45,000 students are studying here at the university in the context of a city with around 320,000 citizens. The University of Münster has a very strong focus on the theologies and the study of religion and also on research of religions. Around 5,000 students are studying in subjects related to the topic of religion, mainly in the theologies. The University of Münster intensifies this focus with investing around 50 million euro into the building of a new campus of theologies and religions, which will open in spring 2024. Here I also want to say that there are some interesting touristic surroundings here in this street. Outside, we are creating a museum street. You have there a very good museum opposite of this building, but also in this street a very interesting Bible museum, which is also combined with the Institute for New Testament Textual Research, where the history of the New Testament is reconstructed and the valid Greek text is fixed. But actually, I should not praise too much to you the rich touristic attraction of Münster and also not the intellectually very attractive University of Münster, because all of you will have probably no time to look at all this because of the very, very attractive program of the 2021 conference of the European Academy of Religion, to which most of you contribute actively. We have around 700 presentations in around 150 panels, 3 central discussions, and 5 keynote lectures. The most what I'm happy about as the president of the Academy today is the fact that I can really open this conference and can open it with you physically here. Only last year we had to cancel the conference and had only a small online program with 4 keynotes and a few panels delivered online. Now this year we are in all possible modes co-present to each other and at the same time full of expectations of meeting colleagues, getting involved in discussions and in new encounters. I hope that this works here on site in Münster, but as well online. In the online platform we have installed a conference bar in which you can virtually walk around and meet other participants and talk to them. Please try this out, also those who are here. As president of the European Academy of Religion, I shall also be there once in a while. For the participant present in Münster, I hope that the fact that all the panels are located very close to each other may help for relating to each other also in the public space of this conference. In respect to the still relevant pandemic, I have been cautious in organizing special social events beyond the academic program. So there will be no conference dinner, for example, as I was not sure how this would work actually under these conditions. But we have 2 drink receptions tonight after the keynote lectures of Rowan Williams, and next night also after the keynote. So there is occasion to meet informally. It's happening if the weather is good outside the building. This remark leads to add me 2 further remarks. First, I like all of you who are physically here in Münster to remind you to this pandemic, the general pandemic rules. You can find it on the internet page of the conference, but as well in many places here in the venue. I ask to take care of this in your own responsibility. Second, I like to thank, I use now this chance of the first keynote to thank some people who have supported organizing this conference since the beginning of the year 2021. This was a real challenge and experiment, considering all the uncertainties in respect to the future, which is characteristic of these pandemic times. I really personally made my experiences with what it means to live in hope in the formulation of Apostle Paul. And I really made the experience as well that almost nothing would be possible and happen without the cooperation with others. Here I thank very much, especially and in some sense representative for others, Lena Mausbach, which I consider the real organizer of the conference, who spent much time she spent a lot of time and enthusiasm into this organization. But I thank also my scientific assistants, Micha Kuhn, Jan Turk, and Daniel Scheuermann, and my secretary, Mylin Schnackels, and all the students who contribute to the organization. I also thank the commercial partners we are working with in the techniques of this hybrid conference, the company Placke und Kuhlemann in Münster and the online platform Summit for the good cooperation. Before I introduce into the topic, which I will now not do, I think I have to go now to the first keynote speaker of the conference. We have 5 keynote presentations in which the overall topic of this conference, religion and change, is addressed. There will be also 3 central discussions, which are always trying to work on this issue especially. So the first keynote speaker is, I welcome very much for the first keynote, Judith Wolfe from St. Andrews in Scotland. And I like to introduce her to you. Judith Wolfe is professor of philosophical theology at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, and is a highly sought after speaker, teacher, and writer. In my personal opinion, she is one of the most exciting and outstanding intellectual theologians in the United Kingdom. Her academic education started with a bachelor from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem and finished with a doctorate in Oxford. Her first postdoc position was in Berlin, Germany, before she went back to the British Island, to Oxford again, and then to St. Andrews. There, Judith Wolfe directs an international research network entitled Widening Horizons in Philosophical Theology, and also an interdisciplinary research project on psychological, theological, and philosophical approaches to aesthetic and religious perception. I want to mention a few publications of her, like the Oxford Handbook of 19th Century Christian Thought from 2017, a book edited on C.S. Lewis and his circle, 2015, then a book on Heidegger and his theology. So I show this to you. I bought some books of the speakers, so to know what they really could say. And also on, so it's worthwhile reading this book. And also a book on Heidegger's Eschatology in 2013. She serves as senior editor of the St. Andrew's Encyclopedia of Theology and as co-editor of the 3-volume Oxford History of Modern German Theology. With Oxford University Press, she is also publishing a monograph on eschatology and modern European thought. But now it's enough to introduce you. And Judith, the floor is now yours, and with your presentation was the title, Reading the Signs of the Times, Theology and the Question of Progress. So
Thank
please.
you. Thank you very much, Hans-Peter. Thank you. It's wonderful to be here in person. This is my first in-person conference since the beginning of the pandemic. And I can say that you are all even more beautiful in person than on screen. So I'm delighted to be here with you. I'm delighted that those of us who can't be here in person can join us online. I will be speaking, as Hans-Peter said, on the question of progress in theology and on the question of the place of eschatology in this. The theme of this conference is religion and change. This is a topic that is at the heart of religion in general, and perhaps of Christian theology in particular. The Christian use of the term theology, as you know, has its roots in the tension between the mythic, philosophical, and cultic meanings of that term in the classical world. Theologia fabulosa, the myths of the gods. Theologia naturalis, the reasoning about the nature of the divine. And theologia civilis, the proficiency in civic religion. In their classical context, these three senses were at odds with one another. You'll remember that Plato discusses at length how the myths of the gods can be reconciled with rational discourse about their natures. And Varro discussed how those gods that are represented in the civic space can in any sense be identified with gods who might deserve that name. And so in its early Christian use, theologia, understood as the true doctrine of God as revealed in Christ Jesus, reconciled or was seen as reconciling those three uses of the term, the mythic, the cultic, and the rational, in ways that had previously been considered impossible, in previously unimagined ways. In uniting the seemingly conflicting domains of myth, reason, and cult, the adoption of the term theology by the early church signals, I think, the generative tensions that lie at the heart of theological inquiry. The confession that universal truth has been revealed in unique historical events. The need, but also the acknowledged inability to express divine truth in human language. A trust in ancient texts that stands in tension with a hope for progress in history. And a reliance on critical reason, which is tempered by faith, hope, and love. And a commitment to social betterment, which stands sometimes at least in conflict, or is at least always framed by the knowledge that the true good can only be achieved after the end of time. In other words, since its beginning, Christian theology, and in different ways Jewish and perhaps Muslim theology, has been about the relationship between permanence and change. This conference is about change in its widest sense. It's perhaps most especially about change as progress. To what extent is progress a coherent term? To what extent is it achievable? How do we think about it practically and metaphysically? And what is the role of religions in it? These are the questions that I would like to focus on, speaking from my particular position as a Christian theologian, but hoping that both the discussion session and the conference as a whole will give a chance for other perspectives to be brought into the discussion. I'll first reflect on the ways that progress has become an intractable term to us. I would argue that it's something that too often achieves fulfillment only at the expense either of those who are to be fulfilled or the object that was pursued in the first place. And then I'll use Christian eschatology as a tool for thinking about this intractability and possible responses. I want to start in medias res, a time that we almost remember 120 years ago, when ambition for progress in theology was tightly linked to an ideological understanding of all history as in a developmental process, a movement of progress towards physical, moral, intellectual, and spiritual perfection. Thinkers like Hegel and Fichte saw God, whom they described as spirit or Geist, as working in and through history to bring the world to the full realization of its potential, physical, through evolution and medical innovation, moral, through the ever-widening extension of the Golden Rule, intellectual, through education and research, and spiritual, through mission and through nation-building. Progress was experienced in much of the 19th century as a process of self-realization of the whole world, led, of course, by Germany, in which often God's own self-realization was also at stake. As early as the later 19th century, and certainly by the beginning of the 20th, this ideal of progress as a whole world movement was shattered by the catastrophes of the First World War and the continuing catastrophes of the 20th century. Most historians, since Leopold von Ranke at least, have not seen history as in any way involved in one single developmental arc. How can one tell a single overarching developmental narrative when actors, events, and perspectives are irreducibly plural and often at odds? Within this new view of history as fragmented and contingent, the question of progress in religion or theology has become unmoored from the question of progress in other fields. More than that, progress can only be understood, let alone achieved, by identifying target goods and moving towards them. One of the most urgent questions of the 20th century has been whether it is possible to identify unified target goods that are capable of coordinating the efforts of everyone, or at least everyone who, in the eyes of the actors involved, matters. Over the course of the 20th and 21st centuries, we have come to see target goods as irreducibly competitive. This means that they require either segregation or the violent prioritization of some goods over others. To segregate means, for example, to atomize or silo off different academic pursuits, or to relativize moral frameworks to function only within certain communities without claims on any others. To prioritize violently means, for example, to impose a total regime or to work towards a transhumanist goal such as the singularity. I want to look more closely at one domain in which the intractability of progress is especially acute. In scientific research and the academy, the ideal of progress, where it has survived, is tied paradigmatically to the natural sciences and to the resulting technological advances. These advances rely on the existence of physical and chemical realities which are both intelligible and manipulatable. We can make progress towards their discovery, towards their understanding and their exploitation by accumulating information and by developing better methods. However, it is not at all clear, and I think we're all very aware of this, whether progress in the sense which requires atomization and extraction of energy and reorganization, is compatible or in conflict with progress towards target goods in other spheres. The potential conflict was powerfully expressed already by Romano Guardini in letters from Lake Como, for example, by Martin Heidegger, particularly in the question of technology, by authors such as J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, whom I particularly love. And according to these thinkers, there is a conflict here which amounts to a crisis in the meaning of truth. On the one hand, the breakdown of organisms into their component material and energy, the exploitation of that material and energy for extrinsic ends, is in some sense true to reality. and that's evidenced by the fact that it works. On the other hand, such atomization and exploitation are false to what these organisms are. They destroy their particularity and their integrity. How do we deal with this? Pragmatically, we have dealt with it by letting these two aspects stand side by side in the university. The university holds, or should hold, a practical balance between what we might call research and education. We in the UK, at least, are used to seeing those two things, research and education, primarily as the two main income streams of the university, but of course they are much more than that. They are at the heart of what a university is meant to be. Research we could define in this context as the pursuit of truth wherever it might lead. The university, however, is also a place of education, and education we can define as the formation of a person who knows how to think and to live. So in other words, research might be focused on atomized particular components, and however we can use them. Education is focused primarily on persons in their integrity. To believe that education is both possible and desirable requires a basic trust, both in the value of the person and in the existence of a shared world into which the teacher can induct the student, and into which the teacher can then release the student to inhabit it, to mold it, to change it. Research and education are not separable from one another because they both pursue dialectically related goods, and I have called those goods elsewhere dwelling and discovery. On the one hand, both learning and research have to be oriented towards discovery, towards truths regardless of what they might mean for us and what their use to us might be in the future. On the other hand, as long as we are human, discovery must lead back to dwelling, to living in the world with each other and ourselves. We cannot fully or ultimately abstract our knowledge from ourselves because the truths which we try to discover are part of a world that we have to inhabit. Learning and research always occur against the horizon of that double question: what is the world like, and how should we then live? This lived world is not simply the world of scientific discovery. It's a set of conversations and practices determined by questions and priorities that have been shaped over centuries. This is why reading and knowledge have to be ever repeated in each generation and by each person. Similarly to faith in the Christian tradition, they have to be received and appropriated anew by everyone. The arts and humanities, including theology and religious studies, are vital to the pursuit of knowledge, not only because they discover new facts or gather or generate new data, although they do that as well, but because they directly address this aim of education and research: to dwell well in a world. They transmit the conversations, the texts, the artifacts that have shaped our life world and which we need to receive, engage creatively, and sometimes overcome in order to inhabit that world and to mold it. The sciences, particularly those employed in the service of technological innovation, discover and create possibilities in the world that sometimes outstrip our ability to live with them. This is the case now, I would say, where information technologies, and especially interventions in what we had considered immutable nature, have advanced so rapidly that we no longer find ourselves in a world that we recognize. The steep rise in mental health problems in the West, despite near unprecedented prosperity, shows that we haven't yet figured out how to live in this world. So although science and technology extend the parameters within which we can act, they do not answer the question of dwelling for us. They only make it urgent. The humanities can offer a vital counterweight here, but, and here's the big but, in reality, they often don't. This is because we live in a world in which the ideal of education and the idea of the human soul on which it has traditionally depended is no longer self-evidently coherent. Those of you familiar with English poetry will know the famous 19th century poem Dover Beach by Matthew Arnold, an elegy to the fading of religion. Hearing the long withdrawing roar of the sea of faith, as he calls it, the poet promises to be true to his love amid the confused battles sweeping the world that has left the world bare by the ebbing of religion. To the poet Matthew Arnold, and to those who follow him, The strength that endures is the sturdiness of human love, along with the capacity of poetry to span centuries, give thought to nature, and give form to formless anguish. In the universities of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, this new humanism, which, according to Arnold, perdures after the ebbing of religion, became the soil of a study of the arts and humanities, untied from theological frameworks. To the sciences' rapidly advancing investigations of nature, these humanities subjects provided a counterweight, a defense of culture. But there are strong indications that in recent decades, the humanities have experienced a crisis similar to the crisis of theology before them. To many people now, the concept of a human soul, of the human virtues, sentiments, insights, and traditions on which the humanities traditionally relied seems as implausible and unnecessary as the concept of God. Matthew Arnold's faith in humanity is experiencing its own Dover Beach moment. This is because the rise of technologies does not leave ideals of the soul intact. And this is really important. The two can exist side by side pragmatically, but we also have to recognize that the rise of science and technology cannot leave simply intact older views of the soul. The Enlightenment and its inheritors pride themselves on asserting that humans are distinguished precisely by being ends in themselves, rather than fulfilling the goals of others, even God. In other words, by their particularity and integrity, which I have referenced before. Whereas nature is determined by effective causality, the Enlightenment philosophers argue, the will or spirit directs itself by intention. However, it is becoming increasingly clear that this second sense of human purpose, this sense of human purpose. Similarly, our political systems are in large part meant to ensure the flourishing of those whom they protect, and yet they manipulate feelings of fear, resentment, and rivalry to dictate what counts as flourishing. One of the dilemmas that we end up with in this situation is a painful sense of contradiction between our experience of ourselves and how we seem, in fact, to work. We are at risk of thinking that the way we experience the world, what we regard as our own wishes, purposes, and decisions, what we regard as our essential dwelling in the world, is fundamentally illusory. That behind it all are subpersonal and superpersonal forces that manipulate us like puppets on strings. This is the vision of reality played out in cultural artifacts like The Matrix. You'll date me by the fact that my cultural references are all from the 1990s. But the films, and I hope those of you who are from later do remember the Matrix films because they really are cultural touchstones. The films, though those films portray an escape from the invisible matrix of manipulation, they may, of course, themselves be just another layer of manipulation playing on our instinctive fears in order to drive up box office revenues. On the one hand, this painful sense of contradiction between our experience of life and what may lie behind it seems inescapable. On the other hand, it is also unlivable. The acute and overwhelming mental health crisis in the Western world is in part the result not merely, as I suggested above, of technology temporarily outstripping our ability to live with it, but more strongly of a sense of life itself as unlivable, as fundamentally at odds with itself. The idea of a human soul, and therefore also of meaningful conversations across time, makes sense only if that soul is responsive to something beyond it. Humanism in itself is unstable. Lose faith in God, you might say, and you will lose faith in humans as well. We can see this as a brute anthropological datum, something that we need to take in our stride, something that needs to be taken in the stride of a progress that might move beyond humanity in the pursuit of truth. And that is a good and fair response. Or we can see it as indicative of the reality of God. And is not the radical commitment to truth, which is reflected in even the first stance, itself evidence that the mind is responsive to something beyond it, something that is not merely self-serving? At least part of us wants truth, even if the very idea of the human fall prey to it. This lecture is not the place to argue from the unlivability of a life in which deception and truth are conceptually indistinguishable to the reality of God or any other higher reality. Instead, I want to encourage you to confront the questions raised by this our situation boldly, and I would like to supply you with a toolkit from within Christian theology for thinking about the idea of progress within a complex environment. This conceptual toolkit is the cluster of thought that we call eschatology, the study of the last things. I have said above that the aim of education is dwelling, to live well in the world. But I have also said that such dwelling may be reliant precisely on not merely dwelling in the world, on an element not merely of homeliness, but also of uncanniness. Scientific atomization may make dwelling conceptually nonsensical, even when it strives to make life ever more frictionless. But philosophy and religion suggest that dwelling well is possible only against a horizon of something other or more than the mere self, or even the mere community. For Martin Heidegger, this something other or more was death itself. Humans, he said, are essentially self-reflective, and according to Heidegger, death is the condition of the possibility of that self-reflection. This means both that we could not see ourselves if we were not mortal, and that conversely we cannot see ourselves truly except as mortal. For the Christian tradition too, dwelling, especially dwelling with God, is not a straightforward idea. It means living well in this world, certainly, but above all it refers to a future which is both like and radically unlike the present. In the scriptures, to dwell with God is a promise of the end times, a promise of resurrection and of a new Jerusalem. Living well in the world depends on living in orientation towards that future, being unto death in Heidegger's account, living towards eternal life in the Christian account. These are eschatologies. They are accounts of life in which the question, how should we then live, is radically determined by the end towards which life tends, in which our identity and our history are fundamentally defined by our future. Some philosophers and theologians call this the primacy of the future. It can seem that eschatology is no longer relevant in our post-Christian age, but one of my arguments, as you will have guessed already, is that this is not so. For most of Christian history, and here I just want to reflect on how we came to the current situation, for most of Christian history, the biblical promise of Christ's second coming, followed by the resurrection of the dead, the last judgment, and the advent of the heavenly Jerusalem, guided people's understanding both of their own actions and of the times they lived in. That promise had both a moral and a historical dimension. Morally, it set all actions within the purview of an all-seeing God who would eventually judge us. And historically, it ordered all events within a divine drama, leading through anguish to triumph. Suffering, humiliation, and persecution were no more than the biblically foretold birth pangs of the Messianic kingdom. Throughout Christian history, of course, religious conflicts arose from questions about the interpretation of that drama. Who were the protagonists? Who were the enemies? Is the Pope Antichrist or the Vicar of Christ? And so forth. But these disputes did not touch the explanatory framework itself. The pressing religious question, in other words, was not how the drama of life and history was plotted, but only what role we each played in it. The Enlightenment, challenging the authority of revelation as a source for historical and metaphysical knowledge, changed all this. After all, the last things were and are paradigmatically revealed knowledge. We have them from the scriptural record. It's from Jesus' sayings and actions, and from biblical prophecy that the divine plan of salvation and judgment was known. The Enlightenment crisis of revelation was therefore perhaps foremost a crisis of eschatology. If Christian morality and world history were determined by their end, and if the reliability of knowledge about that end was radically in question, how should one continue to talk about moral and historical action? And this was a really powerful question for the Enlightenment philosophers and theologians. One of the guiding assumptions of my work, and of course this has already been propounded long ago by Karl Löwit and Jakob Taubes and others, is that eschatology as a structuring frame of historical and moral thought did not become obsolete with the Enlightenment, that it was merely reworked. In other words, the standard philosophical narrative that post-Enlightenment philosophers made eschatology obsolete by formulating theories of ethics and of history that no longer relied on a particular endpoint, is too simple. Rather, eschatology was secularized in the precise sense of a transposition of the eternal into the seculum, the age of the present world. If the crisis of Revelation was a crisis of eschatology, the rise of secularization was, among other things, a transposition of eschatology, a multifaceted endeavor to immanentize the eschaton. There are explicit eschatologies, such as Kant's account of the summum bonum as a grounding principle for ethics, and Heidegger's being unto death, in which life is deliberately anchored in our end, even though this is very much an eschaton-less eschatology, an eschatology in which only death, not something beyond it, is the endpoint to which we move. In the political sphere, messianic promises and socially engineered utopias form the staples of political eschatologies, which we're all very familiar with, not least from presidential elections west of us. There are also implicit eschatologies, ways of orienting oneself in the world which are informed by expectations which we do not formulate, which remain inchoate. The story I sketched earlier of the abolition of the concept of humanity by humanity's own scientific progress is itself such an implicit eschatology, which can be made explicit, but works in lives whether or not it is. In other words, we have a sense of moving towards something which will define us and which we cannot control. In short, eschatological expectations do and always will form an indispensable part of the way we understand and experience the shape of the world and of our place within it. They function as the horizons against and towards which movement is possible or makes sense. We have to imagine some kind of end point in order to have movement at all. When the skeptics of the early 20th century rejected the large-scale, quasi-religious eschatologies of Hegel and in some places Marx, at least some of them thought that they were bravely giving up on all coordinating systems, but that is not the case. Individuals and communities, including national communities, never lack, but always hold more or less adequate eschatologies. Some of these eschatologies are consciously catastrophic, but most are utopian in some form or other. One of the most striking things about these utopian eschatologies is that they mark deep-seated desires, but, and if I'm honest, I think this is one of the basic curses of humanity, they cannot help but pursue those desires in such ways as to destroy their objects. Heidegger's call to being unto death, of course, does so intentionally. Human existence for him just is to live not towards fulfillment, but towards its impossibility. At the point at which we can finally achieve wholeness and make sense of our lives, we are no longer there to see it. We are dead. This is a movement towards a fulfillment which structurally always remains impossible, and therefore life always, for Heidegger, remains a question for us which can never be answered. And yet, for all its heroism of finitude, Heidegger's tale depends for its pathos entirely on the assumption of a desire to transcend finitude, which he cannot and does not attempt to account for. The passionate acts of shattering oneself against death or bearing its affliction, which he so well describes, and which characterize authentic human existence for him, are predicated on a contrary longing, which Heidegger's analysis assumes as consistently as it obfuscates it. Historico-political eschatologies, by contrast, in other words, visions of total regimes which usher in the Messianic age and which we have become quite used to, not only from totalitarian regimes on the right, but on both sides, they pursue collective fulfillment. And yet they achieve it, if at all, only at the cost of redefining out of recognition either fulfillment or those who obtain it. This is most obvious in those political theologies on the left and right that tend towards totalitarianism. The German Catholic convert Erich Peterson, who interestingly is very little known in the English-speaking world, was an incisive critic of such systems' failures to observe an eschatologischer Ausstand, an eschatological reserve. More complex collective eschatologies, including ascendant varieties of transhumanism, also pursue fulfillment, but they acknowledge that this fulfillment is likely to bring the end of the world as we know it. It is not humans, but their successor AIs that inherit the kingdom. This suggests that what I have described earlier as the unlivability of our technological present is in fact part of a larger pattern, which we might call the antinomy of eschatology, the irreducible tension between end as fulfillment and end as dissolution or cessation. Not only in a technological utopia, but in any total aspiration, fulfillment seems to come at the expense of that which it is meant to fulfill, or the definition of the object which it is pursuing. This is already the case for Kant and Hegel, and I would be happy to talk more about Kant and Hegel, but I won't here, and I have written about them elsewhere. But I want to spend the rest of this lecture looking more closely at Christian eschatology in relation to this fractured self of the technological present, and also in relation to the antinomy of secular eschatology more generally. The expectation of the eschata, of resurrection, judgment, and eternal life, is rooted in biblical and creedal statements that the dead will rise, that Christ will come to judge them, and that we will live eternally with God. However, these claims are not arbitrary data of revelation, though their fanciful and sometimes even lurid depictions throughout history can make them appear so. Rather, they define, I would say, the very fabric of creation and humanity as Christianity envisions them. In this system, creation is a gift, expressing the love that is the Trinitarian life of God. The human vocation is to be drawn, at the last, into that triune life of God, the love between Father, Son, and Spirit, out of which creation flowed in the first place. However, this deification, this becoming God, this being drawn into the divine life, is not a calling in Christianity that is attainable by human capacities. This is because to be like God does not consist, as Adam and Eve were led to believe in the Genesis narrative, in achieving autonomy or achieving independent knowledge, but rather in being drawn, and I quote Thomas Aquinas here, above the condition of our nature to a participation of the divine good. Therefore, and this is Aquinas again, although man, by his nature, is ordained to beatitude as his end, he is ordained to attain that end, not by his own strength, but only by the help of grace, which draws him into the love of God. This grace is poured out through the incarnation, death, and resurrection of Christ, as the Church Fathers never tired of saying, God became man so that man could become God. Death, once the punishment for sin in the Christian narrative, is here transformed from within into a means of sharing in the death and resurrection of Christ, and so moving towards that life with God, which is the innermost human calling. This dynamic sublates the antinomy of eschatology because it embraces both dissolution and fulfillment and understands each through the other, cross through resurrection and resurrection through the cross. The New Testament promises of the kingdom, in other words, are not simply utopian. They do not project a linear or even a Hegelian dialectic completion of human potentiality. Instead, they require the death of the old Adam and renewed birth with Christ, the firstborn from the dead. I would like to unpack this a little bit as soon as I've had some more water. This death and rebirth with Christ mark the distinctively Christian interpretation of the claim, which is found in both the Jewish and the Christian scriptures, that humans are made in the image of God. For St. Paul and for St. John, this means not simply being a copy of God's rationality or his viceroy on earth, but rather that humans are united to Christ, who is himself the perfect image of the invisible God. Both authors describe this union in language of sight. Thus, Paul writes to the Corinthians, "Now that Christ has been revealed, we, who with unveiled faces all reflect the Lord's glory, are being transformed into his likeness with ever-increasing glory, which comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit." Curiously, Paul regards this transformation, this being changed into the likeness of God, not merely as a present, but ultimately as an eschatological reality. Thus, he also writes, "Now we see in a mirror dimly, but then we shall see face to face. Now we know in part, but then we shall know even as we are known." And John echoes in the first letter of John, "Beloved, we are now God's children, and it doth not yet appear what we shall be. But we know that when Christ appears, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is." In other words, the New Testament authors imagine a time, not yet, when humans will see Christ or God face to face at the parousia. And it is then that they will also understand themselves in relationship to and reflection of him. This is in some ways very far from an intuitive anthropology. Contrary to the assumption of a basic and immediate epistemological access to the self, which is a prerequisite to all other knowledge, in other words, the basicness of self-reflection, St. Paul here projects knowledge or vision of God as the most direct form of self-knowledge. It is when we see God face to face that we will be and know ourselves, because we are images of God and therefore have our identity in him. In the Eschaton, St. Paul suggests humans will know themselves not by reflecting on themselves, but by beholding God and being beheld by him. There is also an obverse side to this. If humans cannot see themselves entirely accurately in self-reflection, then this is also because the deepest wellspring of their identity is to be created, sustained, and called in love. There is no I apart from I as loved by God, and there is no accurate view of the I except as loved. This too is part of the sense of Paul's vision. Now I see in a mirror darkly, but then I shall see face to face. And the suggestion here, of course, is to some extent that we see ourselves, even in this world, more accurately in the face of another than in our own, because to be loved is part of the basic human identity. This vision of humans as existentially incomplete complicates what we might say about dwelling in the world, because it bespeaks a restlessness that is not contingent, but constitutive of our very existence. In our relationship to ourselves, this should modulate our expectations. In our relationship to others in the world, it should modulate our attachments, but the theological account is carefully calibrated. The human desire for completion is one that neither rests content within the world, nor stands over and against it. All human relationships of love anticipate it, and all care for the world prepares for it. I began by reflecting on the 19th century ideal of overarching progress, and on the fracturing of that ideal by the 20th century. I talked about the experience of an irreducible tension between competing ideals, which made the very notion of progress problematic, partial, or potentially violent. I focused in on the competing ideals of human dwelling in the world, on the one hand, and atomization for the sake of discovery and manipulation on the other. And I talked about their unstable coexistence in the contemporary university. I then argued that the tension between these ideals is not necessarily particular to our time, although it comes to a head here, but part and parcel of what I called the antinomy of eschatology, namely that towards which a system strives is often at once its fulfillment and its dissolution, or to put it differently, that it is very hard to pursue something in such a way that it won't destroy either the object or the seeker. I then reflected theologically on Christian eschatology, which in one particular way makes sense of this antinomy and presents a vision of human identity in which humans are constituted on the one hand, in which humans on the one hand retain their integrity and particularity, and on the other hand have that particularity not in themselves but in reflecting and being in responsive relationship with their maker. I have spoken as a theologian rather than as a scientist of religion, and my arguments have been philosophical and theological ones. It is a separate question whether and how such arguments can be made fruitful within the study of religion, but I encourage us to try. More generally, in this academy, both approaches to religion, theology, and religious studies are powerfully and well represented, and I hope very much that we can learn from one another without dismissing each other as unserious on the one hand or as threats on the other. This is difficult because often our driving assumptions can be directly opposed. Religious studies, or the scientific study of religion, tends to begin from the fair assumption that explanation must be ultimately naturalistic. Human behavior follows patterns which are explicable in naturalistic terms and generalizable across domains, whether religion or other. Religious experience is therefore analyzable as a variety of hyperactive agency detection, or as a resolution of mental prediction error by the over-prioritization of priors over data. Religious institutions are social hierarchies whose roles and dogmas are prestige carriers that can be analyzed functionally without remainder. Theology, by contrast, as I have shown, tends to begin from the assumption that Christian belief or other belief can transform people at the deepest level, because it reveals a world that transcends the structures which are basic to the naturalistic conception of human psyche and society. Above all, the conditions of scarcity which animate evolutionary and social dynamics. In other words, at the very least, Christianity and probably several of the other monotheistic religions declare a world in which the scarcity which we experience as a basic condition of life and which drives so much of our interactions is not the ultimate reality, in which the ultimate reality is plenitude. Theology's basic claim is that on some level, the world is or can be radically different than it appears through a naturalistic lens. It is a matter of theological debate where that level is primarily located, in a perfect past, in the individual, in communities, in the past, or in the hoped-for future. It is also a matter of debate what the exact nature of that radical difference is, and I have given you one vision, an eschatological picture of that difference as seen through the lens of Christian eschatology. In this situation of polarity, it is important not to insist on premature closure from either side. Real dynamism can come from remaining open to each other. Religious studies scholars remind theologians not to turn a blind eye to the common psychological and social dynamics that operate in religious people and communities. If the cognitive processes that are at work in charismatic prayer resemble those that are at work in certain kinds of aesthetic experience or even psychedelic experience, or if the social hierarchies of religious communities resemble those and display the same risks and failure modes as those of insular societies, then theologians must take note of this. Conversely, theologians like me ask scientists of religions to be methodologically agnostic rather than methodologically naturalistic. Even if religious scientists are skeptical of the metaphysical claims that I have laid out and that other theologians make, their encounter with these alternative frameworks of explanation may nevertheless spur new discoveries. The hard problem of consciousness, for instance, may not be solvable on current scientific paradigms, and theology is one of the domains that generates alternative hypotheses. In closing, therefore, I want to advocate a more modest vision of progress, which trusts in the dynamic force of theology and of religious studies. Dynamic, from the Greek dynamis, strength, means both force producing motion and force in motion. Theology should be both force producing motion and force in motion, or in action. It should be generative of new light and change in other disciplines, producing motion, and should also take into itself the discovery of other disciplines, force in action or motion. We can build on many examples of theology as a force producing motion, both historical and current. In science, the comprehensibility of the cosmos, which is assumed by natural science, is assumed by a theistic account of creation, and this propelled natural philosophy or scientific inquiry in society. In society, the New Testament ideals of equality and mercy created radically new social and political systems which are still developing. In psychology, the Trinitarian view of God as three persons in essential relation propelled views of personhood that have defined our civilization. Such theological impulses are not only historical but also current. In philosophy, the experience of transcendence encourages new research into how we encounter reality, both in analytic and in continental streams. In political theory, eschatology is even now catalyzing new political theories and theories about history. There are also, of course, many examples of theology as a force in action, affected by other domains. Historically, for example, the study of other races and religions has forced theologians to think in more differentiated ways about groups which they had earlier been happy to generalize about, and thus effectively to exclude from their own theologizing. Ongoingly, evolution is making us think very seriously about a premature equation of divine will with natural fact. In this sense, the place of theology and of religion in the university can be that of a tent pole, a field that both enables and seeks open-ended conversations with other subject areas because of a conviction that we inhabit a shared world and that this shared world admits of investigation. This also means that theology, not necessarily in every instance, but in itself is interdisciplinary. Because theology relates people and fields to each other, it must be responsive to their questions, their discoveries, and their challenges. If theology seeks to understand not just one narrow subject matter, but the world as a whole, then it is only as good as its understanding of the world which it seeks to illuminate. And such understanding can only be achieved by open, critical, and constructive conversation among people from different backgrounds and disciplines. This is an endeavor that can count as progress on many different maps of meaning, and I encourage us all to pursue it in the days together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Judith, for this lecture in which you, at the beginning, showed up some problems of our recent developments. Then you came to introduce the idea of eschatology, from which we get, say, a perspective in our life. And in the end, you made some suggestions to, say, harmonious coexistence of theologians and scientists of religion.
Not too harmonious, but just enough,
not
just harmonious enough to have constructive conflict.
Cooperation.
Yeah, there we go. Perfect.
So we can have now a discussion, and I first want to say how this goes. Here, you in the room, you raise your hands traditionally, and then somebody is coming with a microphone, and then you ask your question or you make your statement. For those in online, you can also join the discussion in using the chat function. So you write your comment or your question into the chat, then somebody here in the room will collect it and send it to me to this computer, and then I will tell you the questions.
Great.
Coming on from online. So this is the idea. Yes, I have seen. Yeah. So I want to make clear how it works, and so we will have perhaps half an hour of discussion with you, if you have enough questions. So please, the first question.
Yeah, many thanks, Professor Wolfe, for a clear outline of one view of eschatology as opposed to progress. I'm also speaking as a theologian, Maureen Juncker-Kenny from Trinity College Dublin. I would like to ask you, how does your vision of eschatology relate to, for instance, current tasks for collaborating with others on promoting the reign of God? And I'm asking that in view of Christology and theological anthropology. So you were quoting or saying the role of humans is to become like Christ. And you were quoting Paul and John. What about finding out about actions and decisions from the synoptics? How are we able to think about ethics from the perspective of the life of Jesus, not just the death and resurrection? And regarding theological anthropology, I'd like to ask, divinization, of course, is clearly an orthodox kind of view of the future, but another view has been very clearly that of finite freedom and that humans are blessed in their finite freedom. It's not about becoming like God. So I think the theological, if you want, the philosophical antinomy of eschatology that you quoted should really be reverted back to the antinomy of practical reason, which is something that we can know from our own interior self-experience in doing moral things, but knowing that we are failing, and that basically we need to use our will. You were saying the will is something that the West kind of put forward. Well, it's also something that the Bible puts forward. And I think we have to distinguish between eschatology. There is Augustine, a pernicious Manichaean eschatology. There is also Duns Scotus. There are other church fathers. So it's not a unified proposal, nor is the Enlightenment a unified proposal. It's mutually critical counter-proposals. And Kant says very clearly it's up to us to be able to deliver on this. For Hegel, it's a dialectic that delivers it. So, thanks.
Thank you. Those are wonderful questions. There are a lot of questions. I will try to answer at least 2 of them. And if I don't get to the others, then perhaps we can circle back to them later. So the first question is about how to use the synoptics, the life and the action and the teaching of Jesus, rather than just the death and resurrection of Jesus, in thinking eschatologically, let's say, about our moral action in the world and about the building of the kingdom of God, which we're enjoined to do even now. And I think there are a few passages that we can particularly look at, but I want to think briefly about the Beatitudes in the Sermon on the Mount. And it seems to me that in the radical openness and the radicalized ethics that Jesus proposes in that sermon, turning the other cheek, going the extra mile and so forth, one of the things that he is suggesting is that we must live as Christians, even in this world of scarcity, as if divine plenitude was already a reality. It seems to me that fundamentally underlying Christ's actions with others, his responses to others, is a proclamation that even though our life experience is defined by competition, which relies on the scarcity of resources, the scarcity of life itself, and a scarcity which engenders competition as our basic form of coexistence, is not an ultimate reality, and that what we see in God as reflected in Christ is a world in which love and plenitude is truer, even though we can't see it yet in this world. And I think that that there is certainly in the New Testament a hope deferred to the eschaton of a society and a world in which that plenitude is entirely apparent, but also a radical ethic that relies on us proclaiming it already in our action. And of course, this is extremely risky. It depends on us actually experiencing the sustaining power of the love and plenitude of God, even if we have to go without the kind of resources that make for happiness and fulfillment in this world. But it's also something that's been taken very seriously and even institutionalized in Christian history. I know that monasticism is a controversial ideal, and it certainly is controversial in its manifestations, but I think that ultimately, or that most deeply, monasticism is a radical experiment in living this sort of eschatological proclamation of plenitude in specified conditions, where the monks or the nuns will say, take from me all the things that usually constitute human fulfillment, sexual relationships, propagation, my own free will, my own property. Take all these from me, and yet nevertheless I will show you that I can live a fulfilled life from the plenitude that comes from God. And sometimes that experiment fails, but it is a good experiment. So I think that certainly underlies the Christian ethic as proclaimed by Christ. I think that that his discourse of the sheep and the goats, for example, tries to teach us to some extent to see others already as Christ. In other words, to live already in this life to some extent, that face-to-face vision with Christ, which we hope for in the eschaton, so that our interactions with others are defined by that hope. And it's a radical challenge to live like that, I think. In terms of the other question about the will, Here we have to get into medieval discussions. I still think, and I'm not generally somebody who ascribes all evil in modernity to Scotus or anything like that, but I do think that there are two radically different views of the human will and of the freedom of the human will, and they can be represented by Aquinas and Scotus, although they can be represented through many other schemata as well. On the one hand, the idea which we have represented, for example, in Aquinas, that the will is what we might call a natural power. In other words, that the will has a natural goal, which is the good, just as the intellect has a natural goal, which is truth. And that therefore the will is most free in the pursuit, in the unimpeded pursuit of the good. And we have the other view, which is of course represented by Scotus, but is also the dominant view in modernity, that the will is essentially not a natural power, that it's the only one of the human faculties which doesn't have a natural aim which defines its direction, that it is primarily a power for opposites, a power to choose freely without a particular goal. And of course, the eschatologies that come from those two different models are radically different, because for the second model, in which the will is most free in being most freely able to choose between alternatives and between opposites, that will is constrained in heaven, in the vision of God, because it can no longer choose between good and evil or other alternatives. And so Scotus spends quite a long time trying to argue why heaven is nevertheless the best thing for humans, even though their will no longer be free. Whereas for Aquinas, of course, the beatific vision simply is the fulfillment, the perfect exercise of human freedom, because it is the unimpeded orientation towards the good, which is always the direction of the will. So yes, absolutely, there are no monolithic systems, neither in the Middle Ages, nor in the Enlightenment, nor now. But the eschatologies that flow from and underlie these different conceptions are very interesting and are worth pursuing.
I would like to add a very simple question.
That's never true.
You see, so with eschatology, Christianity is saying in the end there will be a life in fullness, no tears, no suffering, no death. New humanist would say we want the same. So is it only the wrong way? But then we could say there are many ways to Rome, as even a Protestant knows. So what would you respond? What is wrong with, say, an attempt, say, in the sense to having such a big goal, a wide horizon, and going now, trying to realize this hopes?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think probably the answer depends on, to some extent, yes. We all want the same thing. We want happiness and goodness and fulfillment and so forth. I think the potential difference lies in how we define or expect fulfillment. If one of the radical things that I just suggested about the Christian vision, or at least some Christian visions, is that fulfillment does not lie in self-fulfillment per se, that human fulfillment lies in being something other than a mere self, something that is essentially responsive. And in some ways that can seem a self-emptying or a self-abnegation, which is not intuitively desirable. And so it may well be that for a humanist ethic, what Christians proclaim as ultimate fulfillment does not seem such, that is in fact a kind of self-abnegation or self-death. And it is really only through faith in God as the creator and sustainer that a vision of humanity as being in responsive relationship to him, as being even subject to him, can seem attractive. And there, I think, is perhaps where the difference lies, although I'm sure that between individuals the differences lie in many, many other and more nuanced spots.
So the next question is here in front.
Thank you, Mrs. Wolfe, for your excellent lecture. I'm theologian too from Dortmund, Thomas Ruster. And my question is very shortly, what do you think about the dualism of the Christian eschatology? Theology has never been able to develop a non-dualistic eschatology. We have always had heaven and hell, and the hell means that it's the defeat of God. God does not succeed to make his redemption universal. But if we try to believe in a universal redemption, we have to think that evolution must go away to the fulfillment what is impossible today. And that's a problem I think is not easy to solve.
So you're thinking about the dualism not between body and soul, the sort of medieval idea that the body falls behind and it's the soul.
There's another dualism.
Yes, there are many dualisms, aren't there?
Still another between animals and non-human animals.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Human animals not, but I think between heaven and hell.
Yeah, yeah. That's a very difficult question, and I think there are many good approaches to that question. When I think about it myself, I tend to think, perhaps without a dogmatic basis, that it may well be that, metaphorically speaking, there is only one fire around the heavenly throne. You'll remember that in Ezekiel and in other prophecies, the throne room of God is always described as being surrounded by a fire, that the seraphim, the burning ones, stand around God's throne burning. It's always seemed quite plausible to me that there is only one fire around the heavenly throne, and that to those who are blessed, that fire is love and power, as it is to the seraphim. To those who are being purified, it is the fire of purgatory, and to those who cannot bear the presence of God, it is the fire of torment. I don't think that we need to assume a separate place or a defeat of God in our eschatology.
Here is the next question.
Jakob Deibel from Vienna University.
It's my hometown.
Really? Okay. Eschatology is an essential task of theology. I think you argued that certain structures of eschatological thinking appear in other fields of thinking as well. You mentioned, for example, Heidegger. Would you agree that theology makes something visible? What is at stake in other disciplines, but maybe more hidden? So could theology still have an illuminating impact? Could theology, because it cannot deny its connection to eschatology, could theology make a contribution illuminating what dwelling in this world means?
No.
No.
No, just kidding. Sorry. Yes, certainly. Yes, certainly. I think it does. That's beautifully put. I think that exactly as you say, one of the things that I was trying to argue was that that eschatologies are always implicit in thought about history or about morality, and that we often in other disciplines don't have the intellectual means of making them explicit, of thinking about them. It's just not a toolkit that many other disciplines use. But I'm certain that the long theological thought about eschatology and about all the complications of how to think about a system in relation to an end can be illuminating and fruitful for other disciplines, even if they don't accept theological presuppositions, simply in order to have conceptual tools for thinking about their own work, and as you say, about how to dwell in the world. Thank you.
Next one in the back, and then you.
Thank you. Hello. Can you hear me? Thank you, Judith, for this brilliant presentation. You spoke a lot very well about eschatology and so the telos of the human person, and how there's been a loss of this view of the telos after the Enlightenment. And one of the consequences of that has been also almost a disappearance of mission and evangelization that has been subsumed now to interreligious dialogue and to also in the ecumenical realm. And so if the telos of the human person is divinization, as you put it very, very beautifully, what impact would that have on the, I guess, the relationship between interreligious dialogue and evangelization as it has been traditionally understood?
That's a difficult question. I think within the academy, the more urgent or the more immediate task is to understand our different eschatologies better. I don't think that we've done very much. Of course, there have been efforts in scriptural reasoning, taking in eschatological texts quite recently by Christoph Schroebel and Leila Demiri in Tübingen and St. Andrews, and I know by others, probably others in this room. But I think the understanding of the large religions and their eschatologies in relation to each other is a very important academic task. The question of interreligious dialogue and mission, I would say, is outside the academy, and those are questions of conscience and of conviction that I can't speak to directly as an academic. But of course, the idea of the destiny of the vocation of humans will determine how one relates to humans of other cultures and of other religions.
So here's in the middle, the next one.
Thank you very much for a very encouraging presentation. Indeed, I recover some self-esteem as theologian. So I'm Luis Oviedo, I'm Franciscan from Antonianum University in Rome. I will not question about eschatology or Scotus, don't worry. But I was very impressed about your invitation to engage with the other side, the other people in the field of study of religion. For instance, in the last years, I have been engaging a lot with new scientific study of religion, especially cognitivists and evolutionary biologists, for a little advantage, I could say. My question is whether you think that is worthy to waste time, effort, engaging with these people, and if we as theologians can learn something from them, because we are sometimes quite disappointed about their research. So whether we could consider them a locus theologicus, as they were saying in the classics. Thank you.
I hope that they are, because I've just put in a grant application for £1 million to work with a psychologist of religion for 3 years. So I have stakes in this. No, I do think that dialogue is important and potentially productive. I think you didn't talk about eschatology, but I will. I think particularly in eschatology, there is important work that's done in the sociology of religion on apocalyptic expectation throughout history. And it is clear that often apocalyptic sects re-emerge at particular points of social, scientific, and economic disintegration. That it is a sociological phenomenon as well as a theological one. And I think that that's vital for theologians to take into account. I think it's clear that there are points in history, and we may well be at a point like this in history, at which our basic sense of our place in the world, along with our basic economic security and so forth, are in so much doubt that we can't but reach for ultimate explanations for why things are like this and for how we can still orient ourselves in this world. And I think that eschatological narratives, apocalyptic narratives, are one of the chief expressions of that. So that certainly the history of apocalyptic expectation and eschatological expectation is also a historian's weather vane to see what the predominant moods and fears of a culture are. And I think that we can't, as theologians, simply dismiss those sorts of regularities or patterns and only theologize. We have to take those things into account if we want to be theologically respectable and respectful. Responsible.
So I do not see any more questions in the chat. I saw also no more questions. So I thank you very much for these inspiring lectures in which you tried to define progress from a theological perspective. And I think we learned a lot from your reflections. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you.
I invite you for the keynote lecture in the evening as well.